The spring auction yard in Pinecrest Station buzzed with a familiar tension of desperate dealings. But 16-year-old Sarah Beth Thornton felt her world cracking apart like winter ice beneath wagon wheels. Her father's calloused hand gripped her shoulder with the same force he used to break horses, his fingers digging through the thin cotton of her only good dress as he steered her toward the Blackwell family's wagon. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the packed earth that had seen too many desperate transactions, and she could smell the dust and sweat and desperation that clung to every frontier trading post like morning fog, refusing to lift. "Pa, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the cattle lowing and men shouting bids for livestock and land deeds that would determine entire families' futures. "You can't mean to do this." Jeremiah Thornton's weathered face remained granite hard, his pale eyes reflecting nothing but the cold calculation that had ruled their homestead since her mother's death 3 winters past. Deep lines carved by frontier hardship and personal disappointment etched his features like valleys cut by persistent streams, and his mouth held the bitter set of a man who'd convinced himself that survival justified any sacrifice. "Debt's got to be paid, girl. Ain't no other way." His frontier vernacular carried the weight of finality, each word measured and deliberate as hammer blows against an anvil. "The Blackwell's been generous enough to take you on. More than you deserve, considering what your mama's sickness cost us." The Blackwell clan stood waiting beside their heavy freight wagon, a family whose reputation preceded them like the stench of carrion drawing vultures from distant skies. Magnus Blackwell, the patriarch and local land grabber, possessed the kind of smile that never reached his eyes, his thick frame clothed in expensive wool that spoke of prosperity built on others' misfortune. His eldest son Caleb leered at Sarah Beth with an expression that made her skin crawl, pale eyes roaming over her developing form with the casual ownership of a man appraising livestock for purchase. The younger Blackwell boys shuffled their boots in the dust, avoiding her gaze entirely, their discomfort suggesting they understood the moral weight of the transaction even if they lacked the courage to protest. "She's a good worker," Jeremiah continued his pitch, his voice carrying across the yard like he was selling a prize heifer rather than his own flesh and blood. "Strong hands, knows her way around the kitchen, and feel both. Won't give you no trouble, and she's got enough learning to read and cipher when needed." Sarah Beth's mind reeled as understanding crashed over her like a mountain avalanche. Not marriage indenture. Her father was selling her labor to pay gambling debts, binding her to the Blackwell family for 5 years of servitude that would steal the prime years of her youth and leave her broken and used by the time freedom returned. The legal papers rustled in Magnus Blackwell's thick fingers, already drawn up and witnessed by territorial officials who asked no uncomfortable questions about the circumstances of such arrangements. "Of course, there might be other arrangements to discuss down the road," Magnus said, his meaning clear as a mountain stream as he glanced meaningfully at his son Caleb. "The boy's of marrying age, and a man needs to think practical about building his holdings. Good bloodlines and proper training make for suitable wives in frontier country." The auction yard seemed to spin around her like a dust devil gathering strength on the summer prairie. Other families conducted their business with the efficient brutality of frontier commerce. Horses sold to men who would work them until they dropped. Cattle bid upon by ranchers, calculating profit margins against winter feed costs. Land deeds exchanged between families driven from their holdings by drought or debt or the systematic intimidation that certain powerful men had perfected into a profitable art. While her entire future was bartered away like sacks of grain or bundles of trade goods, the world continued its relentless motion, indifferent to individual suffering that meant nothing against the larger patterns of territorial expansion and economic consolidation. "I ain't going," Sarah Beth said, finding her voice at last, though it emerged cracked and uncertain. Her hands trembled like aspen leaves in the autumn wind, but she planted her feet firm in the packed earth that had absorbed the tears and desperation of countless other victims. "Pa, I know Mama left money. I seen the tin box under her floorboard." Jeremiah's face darkened like storm clouds gathering on distant mountains, and his hand moved fast as a striking snake, backhanding her across the cheek with enough force to stagger her slight frame and send bright stars dancing across her vision. The crack echoed across the yard like a rifle shot, drawing glances from nearby families who quickly looked away, unwilling to interfere in another man's family business or risk drawing attention to their own vulnerable circumstances. "Don't you speak of things you don't understand," he hissed, grabbing her arm and hauling her forward with bruising force that would leave finger-shaped marks on her pale skin for weeks to come. "Your mama's dead, and the living got to make do with what remains. A girl like you ain't got no prospects except what I can arrange, and you'd best be grateful for the opportunities that come your way." But Sarah Beth had seen that tin box just 3 days past, hidden beneath the loose floorboard beside her mother's old rocking chair in the cabin's main room. Bills and coins enough to pay their debts twice over, along with letters written in her mother's careful hand and tied with faded ribbon that spoke of secrets her father didn't want revealed. Letters she'd never had a chance to read, but that might hold answers to questions she'd never thought to ask about her mother's past and the mysterious circumstances that had brought Elizabeth Thornton to the frontier as a young bride 20 years before. Magnus Blackwell stepped forward, his bulk casting a shadow across the bargaining space like a buzzard's wings blocking out the sun. His expensive boots kicked up small clouds of dust as he moved, and the gold watch chain stretched across his substantial belly caught the morning light with a gleam of prosperity built on systematic exploitation. Now, Thorn, the girl's just scared is all. Natural enough for a young thing facing big changes. Caleb here will take good care of her, won't you, son?" Caleb's grin revealed tobacco-stained teeth and the casual cruelty of a young man who'd never been denied anything he wanted. "Real good care, Pa. She'll learn quick enough where her place is and what's expected of a proper frontier wife. Ain't like she's got choices in the matter. And fighting only makes things harder for everyone involved." The threat hung in the air like storm clouds gathering on distant mountains, heavy with implications that made Sarah Beth's stomach clench with fear and revulsion. She looked around the auction yard, seeking any friendly face, any possibility of rescue from the nightmare her life had become. But frontier communities minded their own business with religious devotion, and her father's reputation for violence kept potential allies at a safe distance. Most folks had their own problems to worry about, their own debts and difficulties that made interference in others' affairs seem like a dangerous luxury they couldn't afford. "Please, Pa," she tried once more, her voice breaking like ice on a warming pond. "Don't leave me with them. You know what they are, what they do to folks who can't protect themselves. What they are is practical folks willing to take on trouble I can't afford," Jeremiah replied, his tone final as a coffin lid closing on hope itself. "My gambling debts ain't gonna disappear with wishing, and winter's coming whether I'm ready or not. A girl your age is a burden I can't carry no more." The pen scratched across legal paper with a sound like claws on stone, sealing her fate with black ink and witness marks that would bind her for 5 years of unpaid servitude. Money changed hands, not much, but enough to satisfy immediate debts and keep Jeremiah in whiskey through the coming months while his daughter paid the price for his weakness and selfishness. Sarah Beth felt something die inside her chest, some last hope that her father retained human feeling beneath his frontier hardness and desperate circumstances. "Gather your things, girl," Magnus commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. "We leave within the hour. I don't tolerate delays or dramatics from folks under my protection." Sarah Beth's few possessions fit easily in her mother's old carpet bag. 2 dresses that had been carefully mended multiple times, a worn Bible with pages softened by frequent handling, her mother's thimble and needle set wrapped in a scrap of precious silk, and precious little else that spoke of the poverty that had driven her father to such desperate measures. As she packed with hands that shook like leaves in the autumn wind, her mind worked furiously, cataloging details and planning with the desperate clarity that comes to trapped animals, calculating the chances of escape. The Blackwell homestead lay 15 miles west of Pinecrest Station, across rolling prairie that gradually gave way to rockier country near the territorial border where law enforcement grew thin and men made their own justice according to personal inclination and economic necessity. During the wagon ride, Sarah Beth learned the geography of her new prison, while Magnus outlined her duties with the casual cruelty of a man who'd broken many spirits before hers and expected no particular difficulty with one more frightened girl torn from everything familiar. "You'll rise before dawn. Get fire started and breakfast cooking for working men who need substantial meals," he said, not bothering to look at her as he spoke. His attention focused on the horses and the rough trail that wound through the increasingly isolated country. Caleb and the boys got crops to tend, animals to care for, business to conduct. House cleaning, laundry mending, cooking, preserving food for winter. All woman's work falls to you now. Mrs. Blackwell passed 5 years back, and we ain't had proper domestic help since. The homestead itself was larger than Sarah Beth had expected, with a main house built of good timber and stone, a substantial barn that spoke of a prosperous livestock operation, a smokehouse for meat preservation, a root cellar for food storage, and several outbuildings arranged around a central yard that served as the focal point for daily activities. Good land, well watered by a reliable stream, with signs of prosperity that made her father's poverty seem even more mysterious and suspicious. The Blackwells had built their holdings through foreclosures and intimidation, she knew from community gossip. But the evidence of their success surrounded her like prison walls that stretched beyond any possibility of escape. "Your room's in the root cellar," Caleb announced, jumping down from the wagon with unnecessary force that made the heavy vehicle rock on its springs. "Figured you'd prefer privacy down there where you can think about your situation without distraction. Gets mighty cold in winter, but we'll keep you plenty warm when circumstances require." His laughter carried ugly implications that made her skin crawl with revulsion and fear. The cellar room was little more than storage space carved from earth and stone, with a narrow window barely wide enough for a cat to squeeze through and positioned near ground level, where it provided minimal light and no real prospect of escape. A straw mattress that had seen better days, a wooden crate for her few belongings, an oil lamp for light when darkness fell. Accommodations fit for a beast rather than a human being. But as Sarah Beth surveyed her surroundings with the careful attention to detail her mother had taught her, she noted factors that might prove useful in time. Stone walls meant coolness in summer heat, protection during storms, and muffled sound that would hide activities from the household above. A single entrance could be barricaded from inside if circumstances required defense. Most important, that narrow window faced east toward town, visible to anyone who might pass along the main road and positioned to send signals toward neighboring properties. Supper in 1 hour. Magnus called down the wooden steps that served as the only access to her underground prison. Better get acquainted with your new kitchen and learn where everything belongs. And girl, any thoughts of running back to Daddy won't end well for anyone involved. He signed legal papers binding you to us, and territorial law takes a dim view of indenture breaking. The sheriff's a practical man who understands community needs and proper relationships between folks of different stations. Sarah Beth unpacked her few belongings in the dim cellar room, her hand steady despite the fear coursing through her veins like poison from a snake bite. Her mother's thimble caught lamplight, its silver surface engraved with tiny flowers that seemed to whisper of better times when love and hope still existed in her world. She slipped it onto her finger, feeling a connection to the woman who'd faced her own hardships with quiet strength and dignity that no amount of suffering could diminish. The kitchen was well appointed for frontier standards, with a cast-iron stove that provided reliable heat for cooking, a proper sink with a hand pump for water, and a pantry stocked with supplies that spoke of a family accustomed to abundant meals and comfortable living. Sarah Beth moved through the unfamiliar space, testing equipment and cataloging supplies with a practiced eye that missed no detail. Her mother had taught her cooking and housekeeping skills through years of patient instruction, but also other lessons that seemed more relevant now. How to read people's intentions behind their words, how to plan and prepare for difficulties that lay ahead, how to endure the present suffering while working toward future justice. As she prepared the evening meal, Magnus and his sons conducted business at the kitchen table, their conversation revealing details about property acquisitions, political connections, and community intimidation that Sarah Beth filed away in her memory with careful precision. These men believed her powerless and invisible, nothing more than unpaid labor to be used and discarded when convenience required. Their mistake would prove costly in time, though she lacked a clear vision of how justice might eventually be achieved. "Sheriff Thompson owes us considerable favors after that business with his mortgage," Magnus was saying to Caleb, while the younger boys listened with attention that spoke of future involvement in family enterprises. "Won't be no trouble if we need law enforcement to remind folks about proper respect for property rights and community hierarchies." "What about the Morrison place?" Caleb asked, accepting a whiskey glass with a casual gesture that suggested regular participation in such planning sessions. "The old man's been holding out on selling. even with all his cattle dying off mysterious-like and his wells turning bitter when they should be running sweet. Magnus chuckled, a sound like rocks grinding together in a mountain avalanche. Patience, boy. A man's got to learn lessons gradual-like, or resistance hardens into something more dangerous. Too much pressure too fast, and folks start asking uncomfortable questions about coincidences that seem to follow certain patterns. Better to let nature take its course, help things along subtle when needed. Sarah Beth served their plates without comment, moving quietly around the table like shadows at dusk, her presence so unremarkable that conversation continued as if she possessed no ears to hear or mind to comprehend the criminal conspiracy being planned in casual tones over the evening meal. But her ears caught every word, her mind storing information about debts and schemes and corruption that reached from their homestead into the town's very heart, like poison spreading through underground streams. Knowledge was power, her mother had always said, and power carefully applied could move mountains or topple empires built on other suffering. After the supper cleanup that stretched long into the evening hours, she retreated to her cellar room with an oil lamp and her mother's Bible. Though reading scripture seemed insufficient comfort for circumstances that tested her faith beyond normal limits. Instead of seeking divine guidance through familiar verses, she used precious paper from the book's back pages to begin recording what she'd learned during her first day in captivity. Names, dates, debts, connections, threats, criminal admissions. Intelligence that might prove valuable to the right people at the proper time, if such people existed and could be reached through the barriers of corruption and intimidation. The first weeks of spring passed in a blur of backbreaking labor and constant vigilance as Sarah Beth adapted to the rhythms of captivity while maintaining hope for eventual escape or rescue. She rose before dawn to start the fires and prepare breakfast for men whose appetites seemed limitless, worked through the daylight hours cleaning, cooking, mending, and managing household needs that never seemed to diminish, then fell exhausted onto her straw mattress as darkness settled across the prairie like a blanket woven from despair and isolation. But with each passing day, she grew stronger and more observant, mapping the routines and weaknesses of her captors, while building a detailed understanding of their criminal operations. Magnus conducted business with a steady stream of visitors who brought news of foreclosures, property seizures, and intimidation campaigns that stretched across multiple counties. Corrupt officials arrived to discuss forged documents and falsified records. Hired men reported on cattle poisoning, well contamination, and barn fires that seemed to strike families who refused reasonable offers for their holdings. Caleb proved predictably troublesome, finding excuses to corner her in the barn or pantry, his hands grabbing and groping while he whispered threats about her future duties as his wife and the consequences of resistance to family plans. His breath carried a whiskey smell and his teeth bore tobacco stains. His eyes held a predatory gleam that spoke of violence barely restrained by convenience rather than moral consideration. But Sarah Beth had learned caution from her mother's warnings about dangerous men, and she carried her mother's sharp sewing scissors in her apron pocket, ready to defend herself if words and evasion failed to maintain the necessary distance. "You're going to learn to appreciate what I got to offer," Caleb said one afternoon, blocking her path to the chicken coop, where daily egg gathering provided a brief escape from house duties. "Ain't like you got choices in the matter, and fighting only makes things harder for everyone involved." "I got choices you ain't even thought of," Sarah Beth replied, her hand closing around the scissors handle with a grip made confident by desperate necessity. "Might want to remember that before you try something you'll regret." Something in her voice made him step back, confusion replacing the leer on his face as recognition dawned that this girl wasn't responding like others he'd intimidated before. She looked at him with steady eyes that held no fear, only calculation, like she was measuring him for something he wouldn't enjoy. The moment passed without violence, but an understanding remained between them that future confrontations would test boundaries neither fully understood. As spring progressed toward summer's heat, Sarah Beth established patterns that served dual purposes, completing required labor, while gathering intelligence about Blackwell operations that grew more extensive and ruthless with each passing week. She learned their schedules with a precision that would serve military reconnaissance, their business connections that reached into every level of territorial government, their methods of intimidation and fraud that had been refined through years of profitable practice. Most importantly, she discovered they were planning something massive for autumn. A coordinated scheme involving multiple property foreclosures, forged legal documents, and a systematic land grab that would require cooperation from territorial officials at the highest levels of authority. Her nightly record-keeping expanded into detailed documentation of illegal activities, written in a careful hand on paper saved from supply deliveries and household discards that she hoarded like precious metal. Each page contained specific information about the crimes witnessed, the conversations overheard, visitors identified, and patterns of corruption that connected seemingly separate incidents into a comprehensive criminal conspiracy. She hid these records in a hollow space behind loose stones in the cellar wall, building an evidence cache like squirrels storing nuts for winter survival, though her winter would require justice rather than sustenance. The narrow cellar window that had seemed like a prison bar now became a communication portal with the outside world that might yet offer hope of rescue or alliance. Late at night, when the household slept and prairie silence settled like a heavy blanket across the frozen ground, she could signal toward town with lamplight, sending coded messages she hoped someone might eventually notice and investigate. It was patient work that required faith in unknown allies. But patience was a virtue her mother had taught through years of quiet endurance against impossible circumstances. Magnus grew increasingly confident as summer advanced, his evening conversations revealing a scope of corruption that extended far beyond a single homestead into a network of territorial officials, federal appointees, and business interests that controlled land speculation, mineral rights, and transportation routes across the entire region. Judge Whitmore owed gambling debts that made him vulnerable to pressure. Sheriff Thompson had accepted bribes to overlook cattle rustling, property destruction, and intimidation campaigns. Even the Territorial Land Office contained clerks willing to forge documents, falsify surveys, and manipulate legal proceedings for sufficient payment and proper assurance of continued employment. By harvest time, we'll control most of the good grazing land between here and the county line, Magnus boasted to his sons during one particularly revealing evening session lubricated by quality whiskey and the successful completion of another family's destruction. The drought's been helpful this year. Folks get desperate when their wells run dry and crops fail mysterious-like. Amazing how many legal problems disappear when men get proper motivation to sell at reasonable prices. Sarah Beth served their whiskey and pretended not to hear, but every word went straight into her hidden records with a precision that would make a court stenographer proud. She was building a comprehensive case against them, piece by careful piece, preparing for the day when justice might finally be possible through proper channels or alternative methods if necessary. Her mother had always said that evil contained the seeds of its own destruction. She just needed to help those seeds find proper soil and sunlight to flourish into righteous judgment. The summer heat intensified like a forge fire, and with it came increased pressure on neighboring families who found themselves facing systematic campaigns of intimidation and sabotage designed to force land sales at prices favorable to Blackwell interests. Wells were poisoned during night raids conducted by hired men who left no evidence of their passage. Crops burned during dry spells when natural causes seemed a plausible explanation. Cattle found dead from mysterious ailments that struck with suspicious timing and convenient targeting. The Blackwell family's wealth grew while their neighbors struggled with hardships that seemed too convenient and coordinated to be coincidental. But Sarah Beth was growing too, not just in physical strength from endless labor and frontier hardship, but in knowledge of criminal operations and connections to community members who stopped by the homestead on various business pretexts. She learned to read the signs of desperation in their faces, to recognize families being systematically destroyed by Blackwell schemes, to understand the economic and legal pressures that made resistance seem impossible for isolated individuals facing an organized conspiracy. These people needed a champion, someone willing to stand against the corruption that local law enforcement either couldn't or wouldn't address through official channels. Her wedding day revenge was beginning to take shape in her mind, though the details remained unclear and the timeline stretched far into an uncertain future. 5 years of indenture stretched ahead like a prison sentence. But 5 years could also be preparation time for something spectacular and comprehensive. Justice delayed was not justice denied, merely justice made more thorough and complete through patient planning and careful execution. Old Samuel Morrison proved a particularly interesting visitor. Arriving monthly to discuss cattle sales and grazing rights, while his eyes took in details that suggested a deeper purpose than surface conversation revealed. His property bordered Blackwell holdings on the eastern boundary, and his wells had been among the first to suffer mysterious contamination that killed livestock and poisoned irrigation systems. But Morrison possessed a stubborn streak in financial resources that made him a more difficult target than most neighbors who'd already succumbed to pressure and sold their holdings at a fraction of the true value. Mighty strange how these difficulties seem to follow certain patterns, Morrison observed during one visit, his weathered hands steady as he accepted a coffee cup from Sarah Beth's careful service. Wells going bad, crops failing, cattle sickening. Almost like someone knows exactly which problems will cause the most damage to particular operations. Magnus' response carried a warning that barely concealed the threat beneath the veneer of neighborly concern. Frontier life's full of hardships, Samuel. A man's got to be prepared for setbacks and be willing to make practical decisions when circumstances require. Holding on to property that's more a burden than a blessing ain't sensible for a man of your years. Property that's been in my family for 50 years ain't a burden, Morrison replied with a quiet firmness that suggested steel beneath his mild exterior. And a man of my years has seen enough convenient coincidences to recognize patterns when they develop. The question is whether patterns represent natural misfortune or something requiring a different kind of response. The conversation continued with careful politeness that masked the underlying tension between men who understood exactly what was being discussed without speaking directly about criminal activities that might leave witnesses uncomfortable or provide evidence for future legal proceedings. But Sarah Beth caught every nuance, every implied threat and subtle warning, adding Morrison's name to her growing list of potential allies who might possess the courage and resources necessary for resistance against systematic oppression. Her signaling through the narrow cellar window had attracted a response from Morrison's farm twice more since first contact. Brief flickers of lantern light that confirmed someone was watching. Someone who understood that communication was being attempted across dangerous ground where discovery might bring consequences too terrible to contemplate. Perhaps Morrison suspected the truth about his difficulties. Perhaps he was gathering his own evidence of systematic attacks on neighboring families. Allied thinking could accomplish what individual effort couldn't achieve alone, if proper coordination could be established without arousing suspicion from Blackwell surveillance. As autumn approached with its promise of harvest season and the culmination of Magnus' land acquisition schemes, Sarah Beth began planning the next phase of her long campaign against injustice that had destroyed too many innocent families and corrupted too many officials who should have protected rather than exploited vulnerable populations. Her documentation now filled nearly 200 pages of careful handwriting, a comprehensive record of criminal conspiracy that reached from the frontier homestead to the territorial capital and possibly beyond into federal territories where different authorities might prove more receptive to evidence of systematic corruption. The challenge remained reaching those authorities through the barriers of intimidation, bribery, and official complicity that protected Blackwell operations from investigation or prosecution. Territorial officials were compromised, local law enforcement was bought or intimidated into compliance, and communication with the federal government required resources and connections she didn't possess. But solutions existed for patient minds willing to plan carefully and wait for proper opportunities to present themselves through changing circumstances or unexpected allies. September brought a traveling preacher named Josiah Christian, accompanied by a young assistant introduced only as David, requesting shelter during an early autumn storm that caught them between settlements with darkness falling and temperature dropping toward dangerous levels. Magnus couldn't refuse hospitality without damaging his reputation in the community, where Christian charity was expected even for men whose other activities violated most commandments regarding treatment of neighbors and respect for others' property. Preacher Christian proved an interesting conversationalist, a well-educated man who traveled extensively through territories and eastern states, carrying news of political developments, economic trends, and federal policies that affected frontier communities in ways most residents never fully understood. His assistant David possessed a quiet intelligence and an observant nature that caught Sarah Beth's attention during meal preparations and household duties that brought them into regular contact despite social barriers that normally separated indentured servants from respectable visitors. "Mighty prosperous operation you've built here," Preacher Christian commented over the evening meal, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes taking in details that suggested professional interest beyond casual observation. The Lord's clearly blessed your family's efforts with abundant harvest and expanding holdings that speak of wise management and fortunate circumstances. Magnus preened under the praise like a peacock displaying its feathers, unconsciously revealing details about recent acquisitions and future expansion plans that confirmed Sarah Beth's worst suspicions about the scope of criminal enterprise being conducted under the cover of legitimate business operations. Hard work and practical thinking bring their own rewards, he replied, gesturing expansively toward maps and documents spread across the parlor table. The territory's full of opportunities for men bold enough to seize them when circumstances present favorable conditions. Boldness is an admirable virtue, Christian agreed mildly, though something in his tone suggested deeper meaning than surface platitudes might indicate. Though Scripture reminds us that all wealth ultimately belongs to the Lord, held in trust for the benefit of the wider community rather than individual aggrandizement. A prosperous man bears a responsibility for the welfare of his neighbors, particularly those facing hardship or adversity. Something flickered across Magnus' expression. A brief shadow that suggested the preacher's words had struck an uncomfortable target despite his attempt to maintain the facade of righteous prosperity built through honest effort. But he recovered quickly, raising a whiskey glass in a defiant toast that revealed more about his character than careful words could conceal. Neighbors got to look after themselves in frontier country, he declared with conviction that barely masked underlying defensiveness. A man can't be expected to carry everyone else's burdens along with his own, especially when some folks seem determined to make poor decisions despite good advice and generous offers of assistance. Christian's assistant David helped Sarah Beth with kitchen duties while the older men continued theological discussion in the parlor, their conversation growing more heated as whiskey loosened tongues and revealed philosophical differences that ran deeper than surface politeness could bridge. David's presence provided a rare opportunity for conversation with someone outside Blackwell influence, a chance to test possibilities for communication beyond homestead boundaries without arousing suspicion from family members who monitored her activities with constant vigilance. "You ain't from around here," Sarah Beth observed quietly, noting David's careful speech and educated manner that suggested a background different from typical frontier missionaries who usually possessed more practical than scholarly training. "Pennsylvania originally," he replied in equally quiet tones, his hand steady as he helped dry dishes and arrange kitchen equipment with efficiency that spoke of extensive domestic experience. "Been traveling with Preacher Christian for 2 years now, ministering to frontier communities and documenting conditions that might require attention from church authorities or federal agencies charged with territorial oversight. Must be nice, seeing new places and meeting different folks. Getting to leave when circumstances require moving on to better situations." David studied her expression carefully, noting undertones of meaning in a seemingly casual comment that suggested deeper communication than surface conversation might indicate. Freedom to travel is a precious gift that many folks take for granted. Not everyone enjoys such liberty, especially in territories where certain families control economic opportunities and legal systems that should protect rather than exploit vulnerable populations. Their conversation continued in careful code, each testing the other's trustworthiness while maintaining the appearance of innocent domestic interaction that wouldn't arouse suspicion from family members who might be listening from adjacent rooms. By evening's end, Sarah Beth sensed a potential ally in a young man who'd witnessed corruption in other territories and might possess connections to honest authorities beyond the reach of local influence and intimidation. The storm passed on the third day, leaving a pristine landscape that sparkled like scattered diamonds under autumn sun struggling to warm air that carried the promise of harsh winter ahead. Preacher Christian and David prepared to continue their journey toward the territorial capital, but not before a private conversation with Sarah Beth during morning preparations that provided cover for communication requiring absolute discretion. Frontier communities face many challenges that local authorities sometimes can't or won't address through normal channels, Christian said quietly, helping carry water buckets while the rest of the household prepared for the visitor's departure. Sometimes problems require outside attention to find proper solutions that serve justice rather than special interests. Problems got a way of solving themselves given time and proper motivation, Sarah Beth replied carefully, testing whether these strangers could be trusted with information that might prove dangerous in the wrong hands. The question is whether solutions come from inside the community through local action or require outside intervention from authority with different priorities. Christian nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like current flowing through wire connecting distant points of an electrical circuit. The Federal Territorial Commission maintains an office in the Capitol, staffed by men charged with investigating irregularities in land claims, official conduct, and violations of territorial law. Good men mostly, trying to serve justice despite pressures from local interests and political considerations that complicate their work. Long way to the capital city for folks without resources or connections. Messages got a way of disappearing before reaching the proper destination, especially when certain people benefit from maintaining current arrangements. True enough, Christian acknowledged, with an expression that suggested personal experience with such difficulties. But traveling preachers move freely between communities, carrying news and correspondence where needed without arousing suspicion from folks who might prefer certain information remain contained within local boundaries. If someone had comprehensive information requiring federal attention, proper channels could be arranged through discreet intermediaries. David approached carrying the final load of supplies, his expression suggesting he'd overheard the crucial portion of conversation and understood the implications of the coded discussion taking place under the guise of casual morning preparations. Preacher Christian's known throughout the territory for reliability and discretion in handling sensitive matters. Families trust him with information requiring delicate handling and guaranteed delivery to appropriate authorities. The opportunity crystallized in Sarah Beth's mind like ice forming on a winter pond, sudden and complete, and offering a chance that might not come again for months or years. These men could carry her evidence to honest authorities in the Capitol, deliver comprehensive documentation that would expose the entire criminal network to federal investigation with the resources and authority to overcome local corruption. Justice was within reach if she could trust strangers who claimed dedication to righteousness but might prove false when tested by serious danger. "Might be I know someone with information worth sharing with proper authorities," she said finally. Her decision made despite risks that could destroy her only hope if these men proved unworthy of trust. Someone who's been keeping careful records of local difficulties and systematic problems affecting multiple families throughout the region. Christian's eyes sharpened with interest that seemed genuine rather than calculated. Such records would need to be comprehensive and well documented to capture federal attention and survive legal scrutiny from officials paid to find technical problems with evidence. Names, dates, specific incidents, financial details, witness testimony, documentation that could withstand challenge from expensive lawyers and political pressure. Record exists, Sarah Beth confirmed, her voice steady despite inner trembling that accompanied irrevocable commitment to a course of action that would either bring salvation or complete destruction. The question is whether they'd reach proper hands without interference from folks who benefit from current arrangements and possess resources to prevent unwanted investigations. That could be arranged through channels that bypass local interference, David said quietly, his manner suggesting experience with such matters and connections that extended beyond typical missionary work. Federal commissioners take a dim view of territorial corruption, especially when backed by solid evidence that demonstrates systematic criminal conspiracy. The investigation would be thorough and protected from local influence by federal authority that supersedes territorial jurisdiction. As Preacher Christian and David prepared final departure preparations, loading the wagon and arranging supplies for a journey that would carry them beyond the reach of Blackwell influence, Sarah Beth made a decision that would change everything about her situation and future prospects. Tonight, after the household slept and prairie silence settled across the frozen ground, she would retrieve comprehensive documentation hidden behind loose stone in the cellar wall and entrust her complete evidence collection to traveling strangers who claimed service to justice, but might prove false when tested by serious consequences. The risk was enormous beyond calculation. If they proved untrustworthy, her months of careful work would be lost and her situation would become desperate beyond any possibility of recovery. Discovery of her intelligence gathering would bring punishment that might include death, certainly would include treatment that would break her spirit and eliminate any chance of future resistance. But opportunity might not come again, and the spring marriage deadline approached with terrible certainty that would trap her permanently in circumstances designed to ensure silence and submission. Federal investigation takes considerable time, Christian warned quietly during the final moments of private conversation. Months, possibly longer, before results become visible to folks living under current conditions. The person providing information would need patience and the ability to maintain present circumstances without arousing suspicion that might compromise the investigation or endanger cooperating witnesses. The person's got both patience and ability, Sarah Beth replied with conviction strengthened by months of careful endurance and strategic planning. The question is whether justice eventually arrives or gets lost in political complications that protect powerful interests at the expense of truth and righteousness. Justice arrives, Christian said with conviction that carried the weight of experience and faith tested by years of frontier ministry. Sometimes delayed by circumstances beyond human control. Sometimes delivered in unexpected ways that reveal divine providence working through earthly instruments. But it arrives for those who maintain faith and continue working toward righteous goals. Evil contains the seeds of its own destruction. Sometimes those seeds just need proper cultivation and patient tending to bear fruit that brings comprehensive victory over corruption and oppression. As the traveler's wagon disappeared into the distance marked by a dust cloud and the fading sound of wheels on rocky ground, Sarah Beth felt a mixture of hope and terror unlike anything she'd experienced since the auction yard betrayal 9 months past that had begun her journey toward this moment of irrevocable commitment. Her carefully assembled evidence was now traveling toward the territorial capital, carried by strangers who claimed dedication to federal justice, but whose true motives remained uncertain despite appearances and promises that might prove false when tested by serious danger. Either rescue was finally approaching through channels that bypassed local corruption, or she just destroyed her only hope of eventual escape by trusting men who might deliver her evidence directly to enemies who would use it to complete her destruction. Time would reveal the truth about their character and intentions. But meanwhile, she must continue existing under current conditions while maintaining a facade of submission that concealed growing strength and unshakable determination to see justice done regardless of personal cost. Winter deepened across the frozen prairie like divine judgment settling over land that had witnessed too much suffering and corruption. But Sarah Beth's spirits burned with a quiet flame that no amount of cold could extinguish. Her wedding day revenge was taking shape at last, though its final form remained hidden in the distant future where federal authority would either validate her faith in justice or prove her foolish beyond redemption for trusting strangers with the power to save or destroy everything she'd worked to accomplish. The harsh winter months passed like chapters in a book of endurance, each day bringing new challenges that tested Sarah Beth's resolve while she waited for word from the territorial capital that her evidence had reached proper authorities and sparked an investigation capable of bringing justice to the corrupted frontier community. Snow fell in heavy drifts that isolated homesteads for weeks at a time, creating perfect conditions for planning and preparation that would culminate in the spring confrontation she'd been designing through long months of careful observation and strategic thinking. Caleb's behavior grew increasingly aggressive, as wedding plans solidified into concrete arrangements that would bind her permanently to a family that had destroyed so many innocent lives through systematic criminal enterprise. Magnus had already contacted territorial officials about a marriage license, spoken with the local preacher about the ceremony, and begun construction on an additional room that would serve as a wedding gift and prison cell combined. The walls seemed to close around her with each passing day. But Sarah Beth knew that walls built by evil men contained weaknesses that patient planning could exploit when the proper moment arrived. "Come spring, you'll be a proper member of this family," Caleb announced during one particularly uncomfortable encounter in the barn where daily chores brought them into unwanted proximity. "Won't be no more pretending you got choices in the matter. No more acting like you're too good for what's being offered. You'll learn quick enough what wives do to keep their husbands satisfied." Sarah Beth continued her work without responding, but her mind cataloged every threat, every assumption about her powerlessness, every revelation of character that would prove useful when the time came for reckoning. These men believed they'd broken her spirit through months of intimidation and isolation, never suspecting that adversity had forged her into a weapon capable of destroying everything they'd built through corruption and violence. The narrow cellar window that had served as a communication portal throughout autumn continued to carry signals between Sarah Beth and Samuel Morrison, their coded exchanges growing more sophisticated as winter progressed, and understanding developed between allies separated by dangerous ground but united in determination to resist systematic oppression. Morrison's responses indicated he was gathering his own evidence of Blackwell crimes, possibly coordinating with other families who'd suffered similar persecution but lacked individual resources to mount effective resistance. The federal investigation progressed with frustrating slowness that tested Sarah Beth's patience and faith in a justice system that seemed designed to protect powerful interests rather than vulnerable populations. But occasional signs suggested her evidence had reached proper authorities and sparked interest among officials with resources to challenge territorial corruption. Traveling merchants brought rumors of federal agents asking questions in distant towns, territorial officials expressing nervousness about unprecedented scrutiny of land transactions, and political pressure building around issues of systematic fraud and official misconduct. Magnus sensed the changing political climate with instincts sharpened by years of criminal enterprise. His evening conversations revealing growing anxiety about federal attention that might threaten his carefully constructed empire. "Something's got folks stirred up in the Capitol," he confided to his sons during one whiskey-lubricated planning session. The territorial commissions asking uncomfortable questions about land transfers, sending investigators to review court records and interview displaced families about the circumstances of their sales. "Could be just routine oversight," Caleb suggested hopefully, though his tone carried doubt that belied his confident words. The federal government's always poking around territorial affairs, looking for problems that ain't their concern. "This ain't routine," Magnus replied with conviction based on intelligence gathered through a network of corrupted officials who kept him informed about threats to mutual interests. "Someone's provided specific information about our operations, detailed knowledge that could only come from an inside source with access to confidential business. The question is who's been talking and what they know about arrangements that were supposed to remain private." Spring arrived with a sudden violence of frontier weather. Winter's grip broken by warm winds that melted snow into rushing streams and awakened the prairie from frozen dormancy. With the seasonal change came increased activity as Magnus prepared for the final phase of his land acquisition scheme. Coordination with corrupt officials who would validate fraudulent transfers, and wedding arrangements that would permanently silence the most dangerous witness to systematic criminal enterprise. But spring also brought unexpected visitors, whose arrival changed everything about carefully laid plans and revealed the scope of federal response to evidence Sarah Beth had entrusted to the traveling preacher month before. 3 men in official dress arrived at the homestead during the first week of April, their formal demeanor and federal credentials announcing an investigation that could no longer be ignored or deflected through local influence and political pressure. Magnus Blackwell? The lead investigator was a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing about the homestead's prosperity and evidence of wealth derived from questionable sources. "I'm Federal Marshal James Crawford, accompanied by Territorial Investigator William Hayes and Court Stenographer Robert Adams. We're conducting an investigation into allegations of systematic fraud, official corruption, and criminal conspiracy affecting multiple properties throughout this region." Magnus attempted to maintain a facade of confused innocence, but his nervous glances toward maps and documents spread across the parlor table revealed guilty knowledge that federal authorities had come prepared with specific information about criminal operations. "Not sure what allegations you're referring to, Marshal, but I'm happy to cooperate with any official investigation. Always been a law-abiding citizen who respects proper authority." "We'll see about that," Crawford replied with an expression that suggested extensive experience with men who claimed innocence while surrounded by evidence of systematic wrongdoing. "We have comprehensive documentation of fraudulent land transactions, forged legal documents, systematic intimidation of neighboring families, and coordination with corrupt territorial officials. The investigation will be thorough and protected by federal authority that supersedes local jurisdiction." Sarah Beth continued her household duties while the federal investigators established themselves in the main parlor, spreading documents across a large table and beginning a systematic review of evidence that would either validate her months of careful work or reveal inadequacies that might allow criminals to escape justice through legal technicalities. Her heart raced with a combination of hope and terror as she realized that the moment of reckoning had finally arrived, bringing either salvation or complete destruction of everything she'd worked to accomplish. "We'll need to interview all household members," Crawford announced, his tone carrying authority that brooked no argument or delay. "Individual conversations to establish a timeline of events and gather testimony about activities witnessed during the relevant period. The investigation will continue until we've documented the complete scope of the criminal enterprise and identified all participants in the systematic conspiracy." Caleb's face had gone pale as realization dawned that the federal investigation threatened not only the family's criminal empire, but also his personal plans for forced marriage that would ensure Sarah Beth's permanent silence about activities she'd witnessed during months of captivity. "Marshal, I hope you understand that certain household members might not be reliable witnesses. Indentured servants sometimes develop grievances against families that treated them fairly, make false accusations to cause trouble for folks who gave him opportunities." Crawford's response carried a warning that made the entire family understand their situation had changed beyond any possibility of manipulation or intimidation. "The federal investigation doesn't rely on a single source of information, young man. We have multiple witnesses, extensive documentation, and corroborating evidence from territorial records that demonstrate a systematic pattern of criminal activity. The truth will emerge regardless of individual motivations or family loyalties." As the federal investigators began their systematic review of evidence and witness interviews, Sarah Beth felt years of careful planning and patient endurance culminating in a moment that would either vindicate her faith in justice or reveal fatal flaws in the strategy she developed through months of careful observation. Her wedding day revenge was finally taking shape, though its form differed significantly from the dramatic confrontation she'd originally envisioned during the darkest moments of captivity and despair. The individual interview with Marshal Crawford provided an opportunity to present testimony that complemented the written evidence he'd received through channels she'd established with Preacher Christian, creating a comprehensive case that demonstrated not only specific crimes, but a systematic pattern of corruption that reached the highest levels of territorial government. Her months of careful documentation proved invaluable as investigators matched her detailed records with official documents, witness statements, and physical evidence that painted a complete picture of criminal conspiracy. "Your documentation is remarkably thorough," Crawford observed with professional admiration for the quality of intelligence gathering that rivaled official law enforcement investigations. "Names, dates, specific conversations, financial details, criminal methods. Evidence that would be difficult to challenge in federal court. The question is whether you're prepared to testify publicly about activities you witnessed and provide a sworn statement that could make you a target for retaliation from dangerous men facing serious criminal charges." "I'm prepared to do whatever's necessary to see justice done," Sarah Beth replied with conviction strengthened by months of suffering and determination that no amount of threat could shake. These men destroyed innocent families, corrupted officials who should have protected vulnerable people, built an empire through systematic violence and intimidation. Someone needs to speak the truth about their crimes and ensure they face consequences for the harm they've caused. Crawford nodded with respect that recognized the courage required for such a commitment despite obvious personal danger. Federal protection will be arranged for cooperating witnesses, but the prosecution of systematic corruption takes considerable time and resources. You'll need to maintain current circumstances without arousing suspicion while the investigation continues and evidence is presented to a federal grand jury for indictment proceedings. As the investigation progressed through spring weeks, evidence mounted into an overwhelming case that demonstrated not only the Blackwell family's criminal activities but an extensive network of territorial corruption that had enabled systematic exploitation of frontier communities. Judge Whitmore was arrested on charges of accepting bribes and falsifying court records. Sheriff Thompson faced federal charges for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Multiple territorial officials were suspended pending investigation of forged documents and fraudulent property transfers. But the most satisfying development was a gradual revelation of financial irregularities that threatened Magnus Blackwell's carefully constructed empire with complete collapse under the weight of federal scrutiny and legal challenges from families whose properties had been stolen through systematic fraud. Bank accounts were frozen pending investigation of money laundering. Property transfers were suspended pending review of documentation that proved fraudulent under federal examination. Legal challenges mounted from families seeking restoration of holdings that had been acquired through criminal conspiracy. Samuel Morrison proved a valuable ally in the federal investigation, providing corroborating testimony about systematic intimidation and environmental sabotage that supported Sarah Beth's detailed documentation of criminal methods. His property records demonstrated a pattern of deliberate contamination designed to force sales at below market prices, while his financial resources provided a foundation for legal challenges that federal authorities could use to unravel the entire network of fraudulent transactions. The girl showed remarkable courage and intelligence throughout this ordeal, Morrison told federal investigators during formal testimony that praised Sarah Beth's character and confirmed the accuracy of her observations. Maintained hope and determination despite circumstances that would have broken most folks. Gathered evidence that made this investigation possible. The community owes a debt of gratitude for her willingness to risk everything for justice. Wedding plans disintegrated as the federal investigation revealed the scope of criminal charges that would likely result in lengthy prison sentences for Magnus and his sons. Assuming federal prosecutors could prove systematic conspiracy beyond reasonable doubt in court proceedings that might stretch across multiple years. Caleb's threats about forced marriage became empty bluster as legal troubles mounted and the family's financial empire crumbled under federal scrutiny that revealed the extent of criminal enterprise built on others' suffering. "Ain't over yet," Caleb warned during one of their final confrontations, before federal marshals arrested him on charges of conspiracy, intimidation, and systematic fraud. "The federal government can't watch you forever, and folks got long memories about who caused their troubles. You'll regret crossing a family that treated you better than you deserved." Sarah Beth looked at him with the same steady eyes that had unnerved him throughout months of captivity. But now her expression carried knowledge that justice was finally approaching despite delays and complications that had tested her faith in righteous outcomes. "The only thing I regret is not acting sooner to stop men who destroyed innocent families for profit. Justice was delayed, but it ain't denied, and consequences are arriving whether you're ready or not." The federal trial proceedings provided an opportunity for comprehensive testimony about systematic criminal conspiracy that had corrupted territorial government and exploited vulnerable frontier communities through a coordinated campaign of intimidation, fraud, and official misconduct. Sarah Beth's detailed documentation proved crucial evidence that demonstrated not only specific crimes, but a pattern of behavior that revealed calculated evil rather than opportunistic wrongdoing. The courtroom testimony required courage that drew upon months of endurance and planning. But Sarah Beth faced hostile defense attorneys and intimidation attempts with composure that impressed federal prosecutors and inspired other witnesses to provide corroborating evidence about systematic oppression they'd suffered under the Blackwell regime. Her mother's thimble caught courtroom light as she spoke the truth about crimes she'd witnessed, its silver surface reflecting determination that no amount of threat could diminish. Defendant Magnus Blackwell operated a systematic criminal enterprise designed to acquire property through fraudulent means. Sarah Beth testified under oath that carried the weight of federal authority and protection. Poisoned wells, burned crops, killed livestock, forged legal documents, bribed officials, intimidated families into selling holdings at a fraction of the true value, built an empire through others' suffering while corrupting territorial government to protect criminal activities from investigation or prosecution. The defense attorneys attempted to discredit her testimony by emphasizing her status as an indentured servant with potential grievances against a family that had provided employment and shelter. But federal prosecutors countered with extensive corroborating evidence that validated every aspect of her accusations. Bank records, property documents, witness statements, physical evidence, and testimony from territorial officials who cooperated with the federal investigation created an overwhelming case that demonstrated systematic criminal conspiracy beyond any reasonable doubt. The verdict was unanimous and comprehensive. Guilty on all charges related to systematic fraud, criminal conspiracy, official corruption, and racketeering that had violated federal laws governing territorial administration and interstate commerce. The sentences reflected the severity of crimes that had destroyed multiple families and corrupted government institutions designed to protect rather than exploit vulnerable populations. Magnus received 25 years in federal prison, while his sons faced sentences ranging from 10 to 15 years, depending on their level of involvement in the systematic criminal enterprise. But the most satisfying aspect of justice finally achieved was the restoration of stolen property to families who'd been driven from their holdings through systematic intimidation and fraudulent legal proceedings. The federal court ordered a comprehensive review of all property transfers conducted through Blackwell influence, resulting in the return of thousands of acres to rightful owners and financial compensation for losses suffered during years of systematic oppression. Sarah Beth's indenture contract was declared null and void as a document created through fraudulent circumstances and maintained through criminal intimidation that violated federal laws protecting individual liberty and contractual fairness. Her father's gambling debts were revealed as a manufactured crisis designed to force a desperate transaction that would provide the Blackwell family with an unpaid servant and potential victim for further exploitation. Freedom felt strange after months of captivity and planning, but Sarah Beth adapted quickly to circumstances that allowed her to rebuild life according to her own choices rather than others' criminal designs. Samuel Morrison offered employment on his restored property, providing an opportunity for honest work and connection to a community that valued her courage and intelligence rather than viewing her as a commodity to be exploited for others' benefit. The territory is going to be a different place now that the federal government's cleaning house, Morrison observed during one of their working conversations, as they repaired damage caused by systematic sabotage. Folks who thought they were above the law discovered that federal authority reaches everywhere, even remote frontier communities where local corruption seemed untouchable. Sarah Beth's wedding day revenge had taken a form she'd never anticipated during the darkest moments of captivity and despair. But justice achieved through patient planning and federal investigation proved more comprehensive and lasting than the dramatic confrontation she'd originally envisioned. Evil had indeed contained the seeds of its own destruction, and those seeds had flourished into complete victory over corruption that had seemed untouchable through local resistance alone. Her mother's thimble caught prairie sunlight as she worked in a garden that would feed her own family rather than a criminal enterprise that had profited from others' suffering. The silver surface reflected hope restored and justice vindicated through persistence that had outlasted evil's temporary triumph. The frontier remained harsh and challenging, but was no longer dominated by men who believed power gave them license to destroy innocent lives for personal profit. Years later, when traveling preachers or territorial officials asked about the systematic corruption that had once threatened to destroy the entire community, Sarah Beth would tell the story of patient planning, careful documentation, and faith in justice that eventually overcame seemingly impossible odds. Her wedding day revenge had become a legendary example of how individual courage and federal authority could combine to challenge systematic evil and restore righteous order to communities that had suffered under criminal oppression. The tin box that had contained her mother's hidden inheritance became a repository for family documents that recorded their contribution to territorial development and federal law enforcement efforts that protected frontier communities from systematic criminal exploitation. Letters, legal documents, and commendations from grateful families created an archive that would inspire future generations to maintain vigilance against corruption while building prosperous communities based on lawful principles rather than criminal conspiracy. The prairie sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors that reflected the beauty and promise of frontier life, protected by lawful government and federal oversight that ensured vulnerable populations could build prosperous communities without fear of systematic destruction by criminal enterprises. Sarah Beth's wedding day revenge was complete, though it had taken a form that required a lifetime commitment to justice rather than a single dramatic gesture, proving that evil could be defeated through persistence that outlasted corruption's temporary triumph over righteousness. Evil had been defeated through its own methods turned against it. Careful planning, systematic organization, and patient persistence that outlasted the temporary triumph of corruption over justice. The frontier remained challenging, but it was once again a place where honest families could build legitimate prosperity without fear of systematic destruction by criminal enterprises that corrupted government authority for personal profit at the expense of community welfare and individual liberty that defined the American promise on the expanding frontier.